There are ideas so controversial, so uncomfortably honest that they are not refuted. They are simply ignored. Not because they are wrong, but because accepting them would demand too much from us. It would force us to reevaluate everything we've been taught to believe. We tell ourselves that we live in an age of free speech, that no topic is off limits. But that's a comforting illusion. In truth, there are still sacred territories of thought, places where the cost of honesty is social exile. Arthur Schopenhauer knew this. He wasn't interested in pleasing anyone. He wasn't trying to inspire or uplift. He wrote what he saw, and he saw the world through a deeply pessimistic lens, a lens that stripped away romance, sentiment, and illusion, especially when it came to one subject, women. Among his most provocative works is a short, unflinching essay titled On Women. It was not an act of hatred, but of dissection. A raw, unapologetic critique of female nature as he understood it biologically, psychologically, and philosophically. Today we would call it misogynistic, and maybe it is. But that label isn't enough. Because beneath the harshness of his words is something even more uncomfortable, a worldview that challenges everything we think we know about love, gender, and power. This video isn't an endorsement. It isn't a call to return to the past. It's an exploration, a confrontation, a question. What if Schopenhauer, in all his bitterness, saw something that we're still too afraid to admit? Not everything he wrote will be fair. Some of it is undeniably cruel. But some of it, if you listen closely, reveals uncomfortable truths about desire, biology, and human behavior that modern society continues to obscure. This is not about agreeing. This is about seeing. Schopenhauer once wrote that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as being self-evident. But some truths never make it past the second stage. They linger in the shadows, dismissed not because they are false, but because they are dangerous. This is one of those truths. The purpose here is not to glorify Schopenhauer, but to unpack him, to take his most disturbing claims and understand what they really mean, not just in the 19th century, but now in the 21st. Because whether we like it or not, Schopenhauer's words still resonate. Not because they're kind, not because they're noble, but because they strike a nerve we never fully understood, and maybe still don't. So before we begin, set aside judgment. Set aside comfort. This isn't about being right or wrong. It's about having the courage to look where others refuse, because the darkest truths are never the ones we reject. They're the ones we pretend not to see. To understand the darkness in Schopenhauer's ideas, we must first understand the man himself. Arthur Schopenhauer was not born into obscurity. His father was a wealthy merchant, his mother a successful novelist, and he was raised among Europe's intellectual elite. But from an early age, Arthur was different. He didn't crave admiration. He craved truth, even if that truth was ugly. He watched his father fall into deep depression and eventually take his own life. He saw his mother move on quickly, emotionally, distant, more concerned with maintaining appearances than processing grief. These early wounds shaped his worldview. He didn't just distrust happiness, he suspected it was a delusion. While other philosophers searched for meaning in reason, morality, or progress, Schopenhauer rejected all of it. He believed human existence was not noble or purposeful, but driven by a blind, relentless force he called the will, an instinctual hunger that governs all life. According to him, we do not love, create, or strive for truth out of freedom. We do it because we're slaves to this will, trapped in a cycle of endless wanting. And nowhere was this will more dangerous, more deceptive, than in the relationship between men and women. Schopenhauer viewed romantic love not as a beautiful mystery, but as biology wearing a mask. He believed that attraction, desire, and even love itself were just tricks played by nature, illusions designed to ensure reproduction. For him, the whole idea of romantic fulfillment was a lie, a manipulation, a trap. His hatred of pretense made him a recluse. He lived alone, rarely socialized, and refused to engage with the academic world that refused to acknowledge him. While Hegel, his philosophical rival, was celebrated in lecture halls, Schopenhauer sat in empty rooms, delivering lectures to chairs. Yet over time the world caught up with him. Nietzsche would later credit Schopenhauer as his greatest influence. Freud borrowed from his ideas when developing psychoanalysis, and modern evolutionary psychology echoes many of Schopenhauer's claims about human behavior being biologically driven. But despite his growing influence, one part of Schopenhauer's work remains largely untouched: his views on women. They are so brutally written, so unapologetically cynical, that even his admirers hesitate to mention them. He did not attempt to balance his criticisms or soften his tone. He described women as manipulative, short-sighted, and entirely driven by reproductive instincts. Whether he was wrong, bitter, or simply too honest for comfort is a question we must explore. Because to truly understand his philosophy, we can't skip the uncomfortable parts. We have to confront them directly, without censorship, without flinching. Schopenhauer was not a genius because he was right about everything. He was a genius because he had the courage to say what others wouldn't, even if it meant being hated, ignored, or erased. And what he said about women wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a piece of a larger puzzle, a glimpse into the raw mechanics of human nature, stripped of all illusions. The question is, are we brave enough to look? Schopenhauer's most controversial ideas begin with a simple, unsettling question. What is woman? Not in the poetic sense, not in the romantic or political sense, but in the raw biological sense, stripped of all ideals, dreams, and social constructs. For Schopenhauer, the answer was not flattering. He believed that women were not designed for truth, creativity, or abstract thinking, but for reproduction. Everything about their nature, from their psychology to their physical form, he argued, was tailored to serve one brutal purpose: the survival of the species. And he didn't see that as admirable. He saw it as mechanical. He described women as short-sighted in both thought and desire, more focused on the present moment, on comfort, on security. He believed this wasn't a flaw, but a biological necessity. In his view, nature didn't care about truth or virtue. Nature cared about producing and protecting children. And in that cold logic, women were the vessels, not of culture, but of continuation. Their beauty? He called it a bait, a lure designed by nature to deceive men, to make them believe in love, to make them feel something so overwhelming, so intoxicating, that they'd willingly surrender their freedom, their money, even their future. Love, in Schopenhauer's view, was a trick, a hypnotic illusion designed to bind a man to a woman, not because she was his soulmate, but because her body carried the promise of offspring. He wrote, "The fundamental fault in the character of women is that they have no sense of justice. Not because they were evil, but because justice in his mind required long-term thinking, the kind of detached reasoning he believed women lacked. To him, a woman's morality was driven not by principle, but by instinct. She would lie, manipulate, and flatter if it meant protecting her offspring or securing a mate. And far from being a cultural failing, Schopenhauer argued this was a biological strategy, deeply embedded in female psychology over thousands of years of evolution. It's easy to see why this view is rejected today. It's cold. It reduces love to lust, reduces women to survival machines. It strips human relationships of their depth, their beauty, their poetry. But here's the disturbing part. Modern science, from evolutionary biology to psychology, has begun to echo fragments of what Schopenhauer proposed. Research shows that attraction often follows hidden cues: symmetry, fertility, genetic fitness. That women's preferences in partners change depending on their hormonal cycle. That certain behaviors once considered emotional or irrational have evolutionary explanations grounded in reproductive strategy. None of this proves Schopenhauer right, but it complicates the picture. Because maybe we're not as enlightened as we think. Maybe our relationships are still haunted by ancient instincts. camouflaged by flowers, songs, and vows, but driven by the same biological urgency Schopenhauer warned us about. And maybe the reason his ideas offend us so deeply isn't because they're false, but because they're too close to a truth we'd rather not face. This doesn't mean women are inherently manipulative, or that love is fake. It means that underneath our noblest emotions, there may still be unconscious programs running. Ancient. Algorithms passed down through evolution, influencing who we love, why we love, and how we suffer. Schopenhauer wasn't offering hope. He was pulling back the curtain. And what he revealed wasn't evil. It was nature, raw and unfiltered. But are we brave enough to admit how much of our modern love is still shaped by that ancient, brutal design? Or do we prefer the story, the fairy tale, even if it's a lie? In Schopenhauer's world, women don't hold power in the traditional sense. They don't lead armies, write constitutions, or shape history through force. And yet, he believed they wield a different kind of power, a quiet, invisible force that controls men without ever appearing to. He wrote, "Men are by nature merely indifferent to one another, but women are by nature enemies." To Schopenhauer, this wasn't personal, it was structural. While men chase dominance in the external world, women far by necessity dominate the emotional, domestic, and sexual domains. And they do it through suggestion, seduction, and survival instinct. It's not the kind of power you can measure in laws or positions, but it's real. He argued that women influence men not through logic, but through leverage, through need. A man desires a woman, and in that desire he becomes pliable, vulnerable, willing to compromise, to provide, to protect, often at the cost of his own autonomy. This wasn't, to Schopenhauer, a conspiracy, it was nature's design. And history quietly confirms this. Entire empires have risen and fallen over a single woman. Kings have abandoned thrones, betrayed allies, started wars, not for strategy, but for seduction. Helen of Troy, Cleopatra, Anne Boleyn. These are not anomalies. They are evidence of a pattern. Even in modern times, marketing industries, political campaigns, and social movements understand this dynamic. Beauty sells. Emotions sway. The desire for approval, especially from women, drives countless decisions in men's lives. From fashion to career to status symbols, Schopenhauer believed this influence was invisible because it was so deeply embedded. Men thought they were in control, making choices, building civilizations, but often they were performing, trying to earn love, validation, or intimacy. He called women the clerics of nature's church. They didn't need to rule directly because they already ruled indirectly through the male psyche. Through instinct. It's an uncomfortable idea, especially in today's world of equality and empowerment. But what if power isn't just about who signs laws or gives speeches? What if it's about influence, about who shapes desire, about who controls what others pursue? In this light, Schopenhauer's observations feel less like misogyny and more like exposure. He wasn't blaming women. He was accusing nature of rigging the game, creating two sexes locked in a silent competition, one for dominance, the other for security. One chasing immortality through conquest, the other through reproduction. This is where Schopenhauer's cynicism cuts deep. He believed that men are easier to control than they think, because their strongest drives are predictable. Sex, legacy, pride. And all of them, he believed, were vulnerable to feminine manipulation, again, not out of malice, but out of necessity. For thousands of years, women couldn't rely on force, so they relied on strategy. And over generations, those who mastered this soft power survived, passed it down, refined it. What we call female intuition, Schopenhauer might have called evolutionary cunning. Does that make women deceptive? No. It makes them adaptive. Just as men evolved to fight, hunt, and conquer, women evolved to influence, negotiate, and secure resources without direct confrontation. It's not good or bad. It's just the design. A brutal, efficient system forged by nature, not morality. The tragedy, Schopenhauer argued, is that no one talks about this. We cling to romantic myths, to chivalry, to equality stripped of biological context. But if we dare to look deeper, past the slogans, past the performances, we might see the truth. That much of what we call love is just war without weapons. Arthur Schopenhauer has become a ghost in modern discourse, whispered about, footnoted, or simply ignored. You can quote Nietzsche in a college lecture. You can cite Freud in a Netflix documentary. But Schopenhauer on women? That's social suicide. Why? Because he said things we're not allowed to say anymore. Things that burn through the fabric of our carefully constructed social narratives. In an era where empowerment, equality, and gender fluidity define the mainstream, Schopenhauer feels like a fossil, a relic from a darker time, a bitter old man raging against the progress of humanity. But maybe it's not that simple. Maybe the reason we reject Schopenhauer isn't because he was wrong, but because he was terrifyingly honest about something we don't want to confront. He didn't romanticize women. He didn't worship them as divine mothers or celebrate them as equals in a utopian future. Instead, he deconstructed them, stripped away every illusion, every fantasy, until all that was left was the raw machinery of biology, instinct, and survival. He exposed what we might now call the shadow of femininity, not to condemn it but to illuminate it. Yet in today's world, that kind of exposure is dangerous. We live in an age of image management, of curated realities and digital masks. We don't want to believe that love could be a transaction, that relationships could be power plays, that biology might still shape our morality. So we sanitize, we censor, we label thinkers like Schopenhauer as outdated, misogynistic, irrelevant. But if he were irrelevant, we wouldn't be afraid of him. The truth is, his ideas still haunt us, and silently, uncomfortably, because we see traces of them in real life. In broken relationships, in family courts, in dating culture, in the rise of male loneliness and female discontent. Modern society promised liberation. It promised that we could escape nature, that love could be pure, that roles could be fluid, that equality would heal us, but instead we see confusion, distrust, disconnection. Men feel disposable. Women feel unsatisfied. And both are secretly wondering, why does something still feel wrong? Schopenhauer might have answered, because you're still pretending. You're still playing a game you don't understand. One written by nature, not by reason. That's why he's rejected. Not because his language was harsh, but because his mirror was too clear. He didn't hate women. He hated illusions. He believed that only by understanding the brutal truths of human nature could we begin to escape them. But we chose comfort over clarity. We buried his work under newer, softer philosophies. We built temples of progress on the graves of ancient cynics. And yet, beneath the surface, in anonymous forums, underground literature, and late-night existential crises, his ghost still speaks, because the problem he identified hasn't gone away. It's just been rebranded. So we ask ourselves, was Schopenhauer a misogynist? Or was he simply the only one brave, or foolish, enough to say what he saw? And if what he saw was even partially true, what does that say about us? What happens when dangerous truths are rediscovered by the disillusioned? In the dark corners of the internet, Schopenhauer's ideas have found new life. Not in academia, not in philosophy classrooms, but in online forums, anonymous blogs, and YouTube channels that speak to men who feel betrayed by modern narratives. This is where the so-called red pill movement emerges. At its core, the red pill ideology claims to expose the lies society tells men about women, relationships, and power. It borrows, often selectively, from thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Freud. But it doesn't just analyze, it reacts. It transforms philosophy into ammunition. Where Schopenhauer offered bitter observation, modern red pill voices deliver outrage. Where he deconstructed love, They declare war on it. Where he saw tragedy, they see strategy, and that shift is critical. The danger isn't just that Schopenhauer is being quoted, it's that he's being used. As a justification, as a weapon, as a manifesto for resentment. But here's the real dilemma. What if their rage is fueled by something real? Many modern men feel disoriented. They were raised to be kind, respectful, emotionally open, and yet, they find themselves discarded, ghosted, or trapped in transactional dynamics. They were told that women wanted sensitivity and support, but watched as those same women chased men who offered dominance, status, or indifference. And in that confusion, Schopenhauer's words strike a nerve. He predicted it, the imbalance, the dissatisfaction, the silent power struggles. His insights feel prophetic, not because they offer comfort, but because they expose mechanisms that still operate beneath the surface. But recognizing a truth is not the same as understanding. Yet Schopenhauer was a pessimist, not a preacher. He didn't offer a roadmap for revenge. He didn't advocate for manipulation or dominance. He simply described, and in doing so, left his readers to decide what to do with the knowledge. The modern red pill movement often skips that nuance. It takes Schopenhauer's darkest insights and reframes them as gospel. Not for understanding human nature, but for winning in a rigged system. It replaces self-awareness with tactics, vulnerability with paranoia, connection with control, and in doing so, it becomes what it claims to resist, another illusion. This is the paradox of truth in the digital age. Once an idea enters the echo chamber, it mutates. It stops being a lens and becomes a label, a tribe, a brand. Schopenhauer's ghost gets weaponized by men who aren't interested in reflection. They're interested in retaliation. But philosophy was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be a mirror. Schopenhauer didn't want men to dominate women. He wanted humans to understand their own suffering, to recognize the traps of desire, the illusions of romance, the agony of chasing what nature compels but reason condemns. He believed enlightenment came from disillusionment, not from resentment. So what are we to do with this dilemma? We can't ignore Schopenhauer. The problems he raised are still alive. But we also can't glorify him without understanding the weight of his conclusions. His words are not tools, they are warnings. The red pill dilemma forces us to ask, can you stare into the abyss without becoming it? Can you confront brutal truths without letting them turn you bitter? That's the line Schopenhauer walked. And it's the line every thinker and every man must walk today. Schopenhauer was not hopeful. He saw life as a cruel joke, driven by blind desire, tormented by illusions, ending in suffering. And yet, he didn't advocate for rage, or rebellion, or revenge. Instead, he offered something far more difficult: detachment. After stripping away all the fantasies and of love, of romance, of female virtue, Schopenhauer asked us to sit with what remains, not to escape it, not to fight it, but to understand it, and in that understanding, to transcend it. This is the part of his philosophy that even his harshest critics miss, and that even his most devoted modern followers often ignore. He wasn't trying to make men hate women. He was trying to make humans stop clinging to illusions. He believed the pursuit of happiness, especially through romantic love, was one of the greatest tricks nature plays on us. That we fall in love not because it makes us whole, but because it serves a biological purpose, the continuation of the species, the manipulation of the will. When we see through that, Schopenhauer says, we are not left with despair, we're left with clarity, and clarity is the beginning of peace. But peace doesn't come from ideology. It doesn't come from online movements, gender wars, or the need to win at relationships. It comes from surrendering the need for control, from accepting the nature of life, including its ugliness, without bitterness. In many ways, Schopenhauer's message is Buddhist at its core. He called for renunciation, for stepping back, for observing desire instead of being devoured by it. This doesn't mean becoming passive or lifeless. It means learning to live with eyes open, to love, not blindly, but consciously, to engage, not with naive hope, but with grounded realism, to accept, not that everything is good, but that everything is, and in that strange, brutal honesty, there is liberation. You see, the ultimate tragedy is not that men and women deceive each other, it's that they deceive themselves. They want fantasy and fulfillment to coexist. They want passion without power dynamics. They want intimacy without risk. But life doesn't work like that. Every connection carries danger. Every desire contains the seed of suffering. And yet, we go on. Not because we're foolish, but because we're human. Schopenhauer's great insight wasn't that women are deceptive. It's that nature is. And if we're ever to rise above it, to build something real out of all this confusion, it begins not with anger, but with awareness. We must see clearly, think deeply, love wisely, not because the world is kind, but because we must be. That's the final paradox. The man accused of hating women may have simply loved truth more than comfort, and in a world drowning in sweet lies, perhaps that's the rarest kind of love there is.